Hey guys, I want to talk to you guys about some of the things that I have been reading about in regards to paganism. I have been very interested in paganism for quite some time now, not because I'm one of these LARPers who goes to some festival, but because I am quite interested in how and why human beings got into paganism in the first place. How did human beings go from worshiping their creator to worshiping his creation? And how this took place in far, far antiquity. We have very few fragments here and there that tell us about the origins of paganism, but nonetheless, we can put them all together and we can come up with some pretty good explanations as to how this happened, or at least a partial explanation. We can't really know the complete totality of the story, right? I don't know the names of the people who were involved in this, but nonetheless, we can definitely come up with some idea as to how this happened. The Book of Wisdom actually tells us about how paganism came to be. It tells us that there was a man who grieved the death of his son, and he carved out a little image of his son, and he began to communicate with the soul of his deceased son. And this explains the beginning of necromancy, the beginning of talking to the dead, the beginning of worshiping the dead. The Book of Wisdom then goes on to explain how kings saw this. They saw how people were building little images of their deceased loved ones, and how they liked this idea. They liked this idea because they could use it to get people to worship them. And so they began to hire sculptors to carve out giant images of them. And people began to worship their kings. They had idols of their kings, and when the kings died, they could continue to worship the souls of their beloved kings and also their heroes. And this would explain how people began to worship their pharaohs. The ancient Egyptians worshipped their pharaohs. The Romans worshipped their emperors. People worshipped Alexander the Great. It also explains it explains how a lot of these different gods and goddesses came to be, how these cults came into existence. I believe that a lot of these gods and goddesses were just heroes and kings and queens that people revered so much that after they died, they just started worshiping them. In fact, I started reading this book just now. It's called It's called The Prose Edda by Snorri Sturluson. This is a book from medieval Iceland. It was put together, I want to say, at around the 13th century or so. And Snorri Sturluson wanted to preserve a lot of the pre-Christian beliefs of the Scandinavian people. And so he began to put together all of these stories, all of these different texts and ancient poems that were rooted in the pre-Christian past. A lot of people are trying to, figure out how the ancient world looked like. And the thing is that it's quite difficult to do that because we have such little material from the pre-Christian world, especially from pre-Christian Europe. We have texts here and there, we have some fragments, we have some archaeology, but the fact is that we don't really have a whole lot of text from the pre-Christian world. The Alexandrian library was destroyed, so a lot of knowledge was erased. And we're trying to figure out how that world looked like by putting together all of these ancient texts and trying to come up with some kind of picture as to how it all looked like. But nonetheless, I think we know still very little about the pre-Christian past. And a lot of times people get ahead of themselves in this whole arena, in this whole pursuit towards this knowledge of the pre-Christian past. Some of us think that we know better than the ancient texts or the text that tells us about how the pre-Christian world looked like. For example, conquistadors went to Mexico when it was controlled by the Aztec Empire, and they talked about how there were these horrific human sacrifices that took place, and thousands of people would be sacrificed at once, and there was massive amounts of cannibalism. And a lot of historians at one point just sort of shrugged this off and laughed this off, and they said, "Oh, this is just some crazy Spanish propaganda. This is just a way for the Spaniards to make themselves look civilized, and for the Aztecs to look like savages, so that they could have a moral justification to conquer other people's territories." But then archaeologists went to Mexico, they dug around, and they realized, oh my goodness, look, there was massive amounts of cannibalism and human sacrifice that took place. It's quite obvious that the Spaniards weren't lying. And there's so much horror that you can read about from the ancient world that we think that a lot of it is just all made up, or that a lot of it is just an exaggeration. I think Julius Caesar described how the ancient Gauls would put people in a giant wooden statue and burn them all alive as some kind of a pagan ritual, and people deny that. People say, well, that didn't happen. That's all just a bunch of Roman propaganda to make the Romans look civilized and to make the Gauls look like a bunch of savages that need to be civilized. But I think that these things existed. I think that world really was that horrifying. We think that we know more than those who actually saw it. We think that we know more than those who actually were there and wrote about it. And we think we know more, but the reality is that we have just scratched the surface about the pre-Christian world. There's so much text that were destroyed. There was so much material that just went into oblivion, that just doesn't exist anymore. And we have some text here, some books here, some materials here, some ancient inscriptions here and there, some archaeology here and there. And we think we know more, when the reality is that we have just scratched the surface. And we're trying to figure out the religion of the pre-Christian Europeans. And how do we figure these things out? Well, we have Beowulf here. We got Beowulf here, and Beowulf, that's what we have. And we have Snorri Sturluson, who lived in the 13th century. And these books just give us little bits of information here and there about how that world was. But we still don't know the complete picture. The oldest manuscript for Beowulf that we have goes back to the year 1000 AD. And even then, that manuscript was written at a time when Northern Europe was basically all Christian. And you can read the obvious Christian influence in Beowulf. And in fact, the story of Beowulf that we have condemns paganism. Tells us that the Europeans who worshipped their gods and who went into pagan temples were living in error and in ignorance, and they didn't know who the true God was. So we have these little fragments here and there, and we think we know more. We have just began to scratch the surface. Snorri Sturluson lived in the 1200s, and he tried to put together as much as much knowledge as he could about the pre-Christian world, specifically the Scandinavian world. And he tells us that Odin was a king. I mean, this is something that historians never really talk about when it comes to the worship of Odin or Wotan or Vodin or whatever. They say, oh yeah, this was just a god of the Scandinavians. Maybe the worship of this deity came from Sami religion, or maybe it came from some kind of native Eurasian religion, some kind of Eskimo thing. And that could all be true, but they never take into account the fact that the most important text that we have about Scandinavian religion tells us that Odin was a man, and that Odin was a king. He was a clan leader. He was a chieftain. And that he was so beloved by his subjects, by his people, that after he died, people worshipped his soul, and they called upon his name. And this coincides with what the Book of Wisdom tells us about how humans got into paganism, they got into idol worship, because they began to worship the dead. They grieved the loss of their loved ones, they grieved the loss of their heroes and their kings, and they worshiped them. This is what the Bible tells us. It tells us right there. And people began to worship nature. They began to worship mountains. Why do they revere mountains? Because they believed that a mountain could be used as a bridge between the earth and the heavens, that the mountain could connect them with the gods. And the beginning of this idea is illustrated in the book of Genesis in chapter 10, in which it talks about the Tower of Babel. And people in Shinar in Mesopotamia say, let us build us a tower that could connect us to the heavens. And you find this in all these ancient pagan civilizations, the idea that a temple could connect man to the sky. And when the people in Shinar speak of connecting to the heavens, they don't mean that they're going to go up to where God lives. What they were referring to literally was the planets, the sun, the constellation, the stars, the luminary objects in the ethereal skies. They worshipped the planets, they worshipped the sun and the moon. Why did they begin worshiping these things? Snorri Sturluson tells us that they started worshiping these things because they saw these things move in the sky. They saw, well, the sun descends and it ascends. The planets move. Comets move across the sky. Well, how are these things moving on their own? Something or some things must be moving them. And so they concluded that it was the spirits that were moving them, that it was these ancient gods that were moving them, or that there were some kind of divine beings that were moving them. And I think that they worshiped their kings, and then when the kings died, they would worship the souls of their kings, and they believed that the souls of their kings, the people that they worshipped, went up to the sky and connected with these luminaries and with the constellations and with the planets. There's actually an example of this in ancient Rome. They had this idea that, in one particular story, I think this was after Caesar Augustus died. There was a Caesar who died. I think it was Caesar Augustus. And after he died, they threw this huge festival that lasted for days, in which they had all these games orchestrated in the Colosseum. I think they had like the chariot races and things like that. Probably some gladiator games also. People actually were killed for the dead emperor, and that's why I conclude that it was human. The gladiator games really were rituals of human sacrifice. Nonetheless, during these festivals, there was this star that was seen flying across the sky, and then the next day they saw the same star, and the next day they saw the same star flying across the sky. So they concluded that it was some kind of omen, that it was some kind of divine sign from the gods. And the Caesar, the successor, said that it is the soul of my father which is now up in the sky. So these ancient peoples, they had this idea that the souls of the dead would go up to the stars and things like that, and this would explain partially why people began to worship these things, because they believed that these things in the sky, these luminaries in the sky, held the souls of their dead kings. That's why, for example, when a pharaoh died, he was basically equated with Amun-Ra. They believed that he went up to the sun. He was Amun-Ra, or that he became Osiris or something like that. And then the Japanese, the Japanese imperial cult is the last. It was, I should say, because it was pretty much crippled by the Allies. The imperial cult of Japan was the last living example of an imperial cult that is connected to thousands of years of history, that goes back thousands of years into history, because the Japanese were worshiping their emperor for a very, very, very long time, and they believed that, maybe not thousands of years, but a very, very long time, they believed that their emperors were basically physical manifestations of the sun. They believed that the emperor was a descendant, a physical human descendant of the sun goddess Amet-Ersu, and that after he dies, he basically will go back up to the sun. And the Incans had this idea that their kings were descendants of the sun. The ancient Egyptians had this idea that their king was a descendant. The pharaohs were literal descendants of Amun-Ra. So the connection between imperial worship and astral religion was very, very strong in the ancient world. And it wasn't just this. They would also come up with extremely religious concepts for their kings that they would worship. So, for example, in the Scandinavian world, they believed that Odin killed himself as an offering. Well, an offering to who, right? Because Odin is the greatest of all deities. So, who would Odin offer himself to? He offers himself literally to himself. So they had this Odin guy who was a king, and Snorri Sturluson tells us that he came from the Caucasus region of Anatolia, which is today Turkey, and that he migrated all the way up to basically, I want to say Saxony, the region of Saxony in Germany. He stayed there for a long time, and then he went all the way up to Scandinavia. And I think that's why the Anglo-Saxons, they traced their lineage back to Odin, because the Anglo-Saxons came from Saxony. They came from that part of Germany. They also came from the Netherlands and Denmark. They were part of. They actually came from different tribes in the Germanic regions of Europe, right? They came from the Geats and the Jutes, and they were Angles and Saxons, and they came from Saxony in Germany, but they also came from Denmark and the Netherlands. But nonetheless, they traced their lineage back to this Odin character. And St. Bede tells us this. You can read St. Bede's book on the history of the English church. He tells us a little bit about... In fact, I want to say that St. Bede's book, The History of the English Church, is one of our main sources for understanding the history of the Anglo-Saxons. And we also have some chronicles of the Anglo-Saxon peoples, but St. Bede is definitely one of the sources that we have. One of the few written sources that we have left. Like I said, we don't have the full picture. We don't have all of the information from that time period. We just have some fragments here and there that have survived the test of time. And also, invaders destroying books and things like that. But St. Bede tells us that they were two brothers who invaded what is today called England, and they were direct descendants from Odin. So the Anglo-Saxons, they said that they were direct descendants from this person, this person known as Odin or Wotan. And later on, they would come up with this idea, and St. Bede doesn't say this, but this is just for my own conclusion. They would come up with this idea later on that Odin had sacrificed himself to himself. So they created this Christ-like figure for themselves. And it's almost as if Satan was anticipating the coming of Christ, that Satan knew that Christ was going to come, that he was going to be crucified as a sacrifice for the sins of mankind. And so he came up with these counterfeit Christs, and one of them was Odin. And I'm guessing that Satan thought that if he can come up with this idea that when Christianity would come, people would say, well, Odin sacrificed himself on a tree, so why should I believe in your Jesus? And Odin, there's also this very strange story that Odin cut off his own eyeball to gain wisdom. There are all these ideas that are extremely religious, extremely ritualistic, but they were all connected to the worship of this man, of this king. There was the reverence for heroes. Hercules was an historical figure who would later be worshipped, just like Alexander the Great was an historical figure who would later be worshipped. Alexander the Great believed that he was a god. He believed that he was the descendant of an Egyptian sun deity named Amun-Ra. His own mother taught him this. And it's interesting because his mother, if you research where she came from, you'll find out that she came from what is now known as Albania. And she taught her son that his real father was an Egyptian king an Egyptian god named Amun-Ra, the sun god. And there's a story in which Alexander the Great and his army is on a ship, and Alexander the Great is literally burning incense to Amun-Ra, and he's saying, I am making an offering to my father. And then after he died, people began to worship Alexander the Great. There was actually a cult of Alexander the Great that developed. So all of the pagan religions of antiquity were based on the idea of worshiping nature. And in worshiping nature, they worshiped man, because we are part of nature, right? We are physical, we have flesh, we are nature. We have our own natural instincts and desires. We are nature. And so in worshiping nature, human beings worshipped human beings. They worshipped other humans. They worshipped kings and heroes and people that they revered. And Snorri Sturluson makes this very clear when he talks about how after Odin died, there was a cult of Odin, and they called upon his name in battle. And this was all part of the worship of the dead. So, St. Paul tells us that they rejected the Creator and began to worship his creation. not only would they worship kings, but they would also worship the stars and the planets and mountains and things like this. Now, why would human beings worship the sun? Why would human beings worship the sky? Why would human beings worship the earth? Well, I think that there were some very, very persuasive arguments that were made that convinced a lot of people to worship nature. Basically, these arguments sounded something like this. Was it God that provided the light that nourished your crops, without which we would die? Or was it the sun? It was not God that provided that light. It was the rays of the sun that provided the light, that gave food to your crops. And without that light of the sun, your crops would not produce grain. Without that grain, we would all starve to death. So it was not God that fed us. It was the sun that fed us. Was it not the sky that provided the rain that nourishes your crops, without which we would all starve to death? Is it not the sky that impregnates the earth? And did we not come from the earth? When we put seeds on the ground, do we put seeds on God, or do we put seeds into the earth? Do we not impregnate the earth with the seeds of our food for our harvests? And do these seeds not grow from the earth? And did we ourselves not come from the earth? So why can't we call the earth our mother? And if the earth is our mother, then that means that the sky is our father, because the sky impregnates the earth with his water, with his rain. And with that rain, we have fecund and rich soils that provide us our nourishment, that provide us an abundance of food, an abundance of grain, without which we would all starve. Was it not the trees that gave us that lumber by which we built all of these homes, that give us shelter and refuge from the elements, from the cold, from the rain? Is it not the trees that bring forth nuts and fruits that nourish our bodies? It was not God that gave us all these things. It was the earth. It was the trees. And so man began to worship these things. It's almost like they had a materialistic view of religion. It's not God that gives us these things. It's the earth. It's the sun. It's the things that we can see. And we can't see this God, but we can see the sun. We can see the moon. We can see the rain. We can see the earth. We can see the trees. We can see all these things. It's easier to put faith on these things than it is on God. And yet God, all he does is asks us for offerings. And so I believe it was with this mentality that human beings began to worship nature. It's not God that's protecting us. It's this mighty king. It's this warrior that's protecting us. Why not worship him? That, in fact, was the worship of the Pharaoh. The worship of the Pharaoh. Very interesting. And I have heard no one bring this up. Maybe some scholar who lived in the early 1900s brought this up, but I don't hear anybody today bringing this up. The worship of the golden calf in the book of Exodus. That was the worship of the Pharaoh. I am convinced of this 100%. Because the Pharaoh was equated with a calf. The Pharaoh was equated with being a bull. And I think this goes back to African pagan religion, because in African tribal religions, the chieftain is called a bull, equated with a bull. I think, who was it? Was it that Zulu king? I don't remember his name. I don't remember his name, but there was a chieftain in Africa in the I want to say in the Zulu nation, and he was known as, I think they called him the Great Bull. But this is part of African religion. And the Pharaoh was known as this, as being like a bull or a calf, and his mother was seen as being a cow. And so when the Hebrews said, let's worship this golden calf, they were literally saying, let's worship the Pharaoh. Right? Because what was one of the protests against Moses? Moses, you brought us to this desert to die. God doesn't care about us, even though they literally saw God split the Red Sea, and they literally saw God curse Egypt with 7 plagues. But that still wasn't convincing enough for them. And they said, Moses, you brought us out here to die. We are tired of eating whatever food there is that we're eating. We want garlic, we want leeks, we want onions, we want all these good things. And it was better that we just lived in Egypt. We were better off as slaves in Egypt. And so they said, let's worship the image of Pharaoh. And so they developed this giant statue. They put together this giant statue of a golden calf, and that was the worship of the Pharaoh. Because the golden calf in Egyptian religion was equated to the Pharaoh. So they were literally saying, let's go back to Egypt. And if you read St. Stephen's speech to the Jews before he gets stoned to death, he talks about how the Hebrews worshiped the golden calf and how in doing so their hearts went back to Egypt. I think the prophet Jeremiah gives us a similar explanation. And they were basically saying, let's go back to Egypt. Let's go back to the worship of the Pharaoh. Why? Because our lives were better off under him. We had food, and the food was way better than what we're getting here. And so this was a part of paganism. It was, this man is giving us refuge, not God. The sun gives our plants, our crops, the light that they need, the photosynthesis that they need to produce food, not God. The rain is what nourishes the crops with water, it's not God. The trees give us nuts and wood for shelter and fruits, it's not God. And so this is how mankind began to go to paganism. And I think that what we are seeing today is basically what happened in ancient antiquity. In ancient antiquity, mankind knew who God was. Noah was a priest. He had 3 sons. He taught his sons about God, no doubt. And those 3 sons taught their children about God. Somewhere along the line, there was a moment when mankind turned against God. And I would not doubt that it began in Anatolia. Because remember, the ark crashed in Mount Ararat, which is in Anatolia. It lies right between Armenia and Turkey. And I think the most ancient religious ruins that we have seen so far are in Anatolia. Very, very ancient stuff. And so I wouldn't be surprised that it began in Anatolia, it spread around, and eventually people began to build the Tower of Babel as some kind of a pagan pilgrimage site, and God got rid of it. God squashed it. But paganism lived on. And you can see little bits of this in the Old Testament. So, for example, when Moses meets Jethro, Jethro is a priest of the true God in Midian. He's a priest in Midian. He knows who the true God is, but nonetheless, he has other deities. And after the Exodus, Jethro tells Moses, now seeing all these miracles, now I know that your God is the true God. There's also an example of this in the book of Genesis, where it talks about the king of Egypt seeing Joshua, and the king of, not Joshua, sorry, Joseph. The king of Egypt sees Joseph, and he says, the king of Egypt says something like, I see God in you. I see that God is with you. So the pharaohs had a knowledge of God. But it also says that the Egyptian government gave a wife to Joseph, and she was the daughter of the priest of the sun. So in the time of Joseph, they were already worshiping nature, but they also had a knowledge of the true God nonetheless. Because that knowledge of the true God didn't just disappear overnight. It took a lot of time for that to happen. And then by the time you reach the generation of Moses, that knowledge of the true God is pretty much gone. Because when Moses goes to the Pharaoh and says, the Lord says, let my people go so that they may worship me, what does Pharaoh tell Moses? Who is your God that I should obey him? So by the time you reach the era of Moses, that knowledge of God in Egypt is pretty much long gone. But in these ancient books, or in these texts that link back to far antiquity, we get an idea of paganism, and we also get some idea as to how paganism began. So it's all pretty fascinating stuff. And they also, here's another thing, they worshipped trees in ancient times. And I think that this also could have been linked to the tree of good and evil in the Garden of Eden. there is in Scandinavian religion there was the idea of the Yggdrasil. Yggdrasil was the world tree, and it was the realm of the gods. It was the holiest realm of the gods, and they believed that it was a sacred tree whose branches reached all the way up to the heavens, and there were some steeds that lived on the branches of the tree, and they ate its leaves. And then above the tree there were wolves who were chasing. I think they were chasing like wagons that were holding the sun and the moon or something like that. But the Scandinavians really believed in this, and they believed that underneath the tree, or that at one of the roots of the tree, were three women who dictated the fate of mankind. And then circling around the tree, yes, there were wolves that chased after these wagons that held the moon and the sun. And then underneath the tree was a giant serpent, and this serpent circled around all of the world, all of the earth. And it's interesting that they have this tree, and then they have the serpent. And they believe that this tree, Yggdrasil literally means the horse of Odin. Yg was another name of Odin, and Drasil, I think, was another word for horse. The Odin's horse. They also connected this terminology to Odin sacrificing himself to himself. Odin hung himself for 9 days, and then as he was hanging by his neck, his body was moving back and forth. It was sort of riding the air, and so they sort of connected this to Odin riding his horse, so that when he was hanging from the noose, he was waving, his body was waving back and forth, and it looked as if he was riding his horse. So they call it Yggdrasil, the world tree, and they connect this tree to Odin's sacrifice to himself, and they connect this tree to all of the gods. And the fact that they would have this tree and then they would have this serpent next to it, I find to be quite fascinating. And I wouldn't be surprised that these ancient peoples, they saw the realm of the gods as the Garden of Eden, and that this tree was the world tree. The tree that Adam and Eve ate from was the world tree, and that this serpent underneath the Yggdrasil was just sort of a misconstrued memory of the serpent that deceived Eve. I wouldn't be surprised about this at all. I would not. I believe that paganism, if you look at what ancient pagans believed in, I wouldn't doubt that some of the things in ancient paganism were merely corruptions of the one true religion that was taught by Noah, and that a lot of these stories, or some of these stories, were simply corruptions of the original story that is taught in the Bible. Another example of this is in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is in the Sumerian history. Gilgamesh was an ancient king, and Gilgamesh, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it talks about how this king was pursuing eternal life. Gilgamesh wanted to be immortal, and so in wanting to be immortal, he entered the realm of the dead, and there he met this old man who told him about how the gods, or the god Enlil, forewarned that a flood was coming, and that this man built an ark that saved humanity. So basically, Gilgamesh met Noah. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh met Noah. Although he's not named Noah, this person is a corruption of the original character of Noah. And Gilgamesh asks him about how to obtain immortal life, how to obtain immortality. And this man who built the ark tells Gilgamesh that there is a tree, and this tree has fruit, and if you eat of this fruit, it'll give you life forever. And Gilgamesh finds this tree, but the problem is that the tree is guarded by a giant snake, and Gilgamesh cannot eat of its fruit. So here you have a tree with the fruit, and the fruit gives you immortality, and then there's a serpent around the tree. And by immortality, Gilgamesh wanted to become a god, right? He wanted to become a god, gain immortality. And when he goes to this tree to gain that immortality, there is a serpent. When Eve goes to the tree, there was a serpent. and she wanted to eat of the fruit, believing that this fruit would give her divinity. And in the Scandinavian religion, there is a world tree. Around the world tree is a serpent, and this tree is believed to have been the realm of the gods, the realm of those who basically reach divinity. So in the pagan texts, in the pagan world, this tree was seen as something to seek after. It was seen as a source of immortality, or it was seen as a realm of immortality, a realm of godhood. It is only in the Hebrew religion, in the religion of Israel, that we find this tree being the beginning or part of the beginning of man's downfall. That man, wanting to reach that divinity by this tree, was corrupted and met his downfall. So it's a radical difference from the pagan world. Anyway, I've talked long enough. You guys have just heard some theology. God bless.